1 minute to go, and the whole place is filled. Someone just said to me, "Who is that guy in the plaid jacket?" You know who he is, Todd DePastino. Anyhow, in any war, there are always people that had to learn codes, different kind of codes, or to have ways that they could communicate, whether they were prisoners or if they're sending messages back and forth. So it doesn't matter whether it was thousands of years ago or the Vietnam War or today's war. Well, about 45 years ago, I was teaching the kids different number bases. Like, we have base 10, the decimal system. So then I was teaching them about the Mayans, who had base 20. And then it went to base 5, where you would have 1, 2, 3, 4, and then there was no 5s, then you have to say 1, 0, etc. And that led to binary, which is what the computers use. So I had an epiphany, and I thought, 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, right? Watch this. We could do the whole alphabet on one hand. So if we're ever in trouble, we can communicate with each other. But watch this. Is this 1? Everybody show me 1. 1, 2, 8, 4, 8, 16. So now, if you take A is 1, B is 2, C is 3, you need a T. I'm always going to tell you up front. T is 20. So we need a 16 and a 4. Okay? That's T. T. Now, 15, the 0, the O for Todd is 15. Well, you can't use the 16, but you could have the 8, the 4, the 2, and a 1. And there's your O right there. Now, I don't want Todd to think that I'm giving him the finger. But this is the D. 1, 2, 4, right? A, B, C, D. So, anyhow, this is the D and the P again. So, ladies and gentlemen, Todd DePastino.
Thank you. I hope we never face a situation where I need to use that code, because I will absolutely be lost. We are in the second part of a series on the history of Vietnam and the Vietnam War, a series that's going to take us through to the end of the year. Tonight is part 2, and I have to say it's a little intellectually demanding. I think it's going to demand a little bit more of you than some normal talks are, because teaching this part of the history of Vietnam is not like teaching, Alexander Hamilton or World War II, or what we call the Vietnam War, which was fought largely between 1965 and 1973. Those topics are mostly familiar to us. We've at least heard of them. We at least understand something about Alexander Hamilton and the Vietnam War. What I'm going to talk about tonight is much more obscure and in many cases abstract, concepts that are rather abstract, because we're going back to a time before the Americans got involved in Vietnam, when Vietnam was a colony of the French. And you'll remember that the French arrived. Europe largely ignored Vietnam for hundreds of years because the Vietnamese had a reputation for being difficult to handle, difficult to deal with. You would land on their shore and they would shoot at you, They didn't even wait for you to say hello. And that was bred, of course, from a millennium of fighting Chinese occupation. So when the French arrived in 1858, the Vietnamese did what they normally did, and they fought back. And it took the French 30 years. 30 years to subdue what we call Vietnam and to create a new colony that they called French Indochina. You might ask, what was worth 30 years of fighting to conquer French Indochina? And one of the first governor generals of Vietnam, I think, of French Indochina, answered the question when he said, colonial policy is the daughter of industrial policy. And that meant that what France wanted from French Indochina largely was raw materials. They wanted other things, but largely they wanted to extract the wealth of raw materials that were available in Vietnam that previously had no value whatsoever. Rubber, before the second industrial revolution, rubber was useful for one thing and one thing only before then: rubbing out pencil marks, which is why it was called rubber. But suddenly, with the internal combustion engine and the need for tires, rubber becomes an essential commodity for a modern industrial economy. And you can see this is an early map that the French made of what they called Indochine or Indochina, and you can see it's marked with coal in the north and some rice here, and timber and tea and sugar and coffee, and then of course rice everywhere else. And that is exactly what the French were after. They were after this incredible wealth of raw materials. Coal in the north, rubber was not native to Asia, it was not native to Vietnam, it was native to South America, but the French brought rubber in because it was a perfect climate for the growing of rubber. Subtropical, semi-tropical, a lot of rain, a lot of heat. And so rubber plantations were created very quickly in the South, and I mean, these things were gigantic. Absolutely gigantic. The Michelin rubber plantation, about 75 kilometers northwest of Saigon, was probably the most famous. It had 30,000 people working on it at any one time. I mean, these are gigantic industrial scale operations. There were rice plantations. Rice, for the first time, was exported under the French. Rice exports had been banned under the emperors, but the French grew rice on a commercial scale and exported it around the world, including to Europe. Tea, grown in Vietnam in a massive way. Coffee, also not native to Vietnam, never grown, never drunk in Vietnam, but the French brought it over because of the climate and started growing it. Jute might be something you never heard of, but jute is the raw material out of which you make burlap. What? How did you know that? Because you're smart. Damn it, I had to look that up. Yeah, it's burlap. It's how you make burlap, it's how you make rope, and jute. Vietnam had a perfect climate for jute. Tungsten. Vietnam happens to control a large portion of the world's tungsten. A pretty rare mineral. That's a metal that's involved with electricity, with the electrification of Europe. Tungsten became valuable. Tin, also available in large amounts. Zinc. And the problem is that to extract all of this, all these materials, to grow the tea, to grow the coffee, to grow the rice, to harvest the rubber, to extract the coal and the tungsten and the zinc, you needed armies of industrial labor, armies of wage laborers. And there were zero, or just about zero, wage laborers in Vietnam. Very few. The Vietnamese already had a job, and that was called being a peasant. 90% of the Vietnamese population were peasants. 90%. And a peasant is an unusual creature. They ain't like us at all. They are very different in their way of life, and they're very different in their consciousness, how they think about themselves and how they think about the world. And I'm going to talk largely about peasants tonight and how unusual they are. We tend to take it for granted that peasants are just subsistence farmers that we could kind of relate to. And that is the definition, the technical definition of a peasant, is a subsistence farmer. That is, somebody who farms just enough to feed themselves, to survive. They're not commercial farmers. But this whole way of life around subsistence farming breeds certain values and breeds certain characteristics that are universal across the world. One of them is, of course, they're agrarian. They're involved in agriculture. Another is they're communal, extremely important. The peasants' world, we're going to talk about this, revolves around, in Vietnam, the village. They live in communal societies, not individualistic societies. And the third thing that you have to understand about peasants is they are profoundly conservative. Profoundly conservative. Their number one concern is security. That's all they really care about. They don't like change. Any change. Even change that we might consider change for the better. They reject it out of hand. And if there's one thing that the French brought to Vietnam, it was change. And they brought it rapidly over the period of the next 30 years. After the founding of French Indochina in 1887, France immediately started to try to convert the Vietnamese peasantry into wage laborers to work in coal mines and tin mines and rice plantations and rubber plantations. That was the goal of French colonization. So you have the traditional peasant up here, living a traditional life. Within 30 years, and this is a rickshaw driver pulling the Michelin Man, you can see here in the rickshaw, and even factory workers who are in Annam, in central Vietnam, making ammunition at an ammunition plant. Peasants. If you go back far enough in all our family histories, everybody in here, you could find a peasant. Some of you have to go back farther than others. Others, like me, you don't have to go back far at all. You go to my great-grandparents, all of them came to this country as peasants. And they were very much like these Vietnamese peasants. Peasants are peasants no matter where you see them. No matter what language they speak, no matter what God they worship, no matter what color their skin is, it's remarkable how similar they are. They have very similar, consistent cultures and values and worldviews across time and space, whether you're talking about Ireland in the 19th century, Russia in the 18th century, France in the 19th century, or present-day Iraq or Afghanistan. Peasants are peasants, and they have an unusual approach towards life that's built from the material conditions of their existence. The first great scholar of the peasantry was a guy named R.H. Tawney, who wrote this book. I don't recommend it. It was published in 1912, called The Agrarian Problem in the 16th Century, and it's about England. It's about England. Why was there so much unrest in England in the 1500s, in the 16th century? And it's because the English were doing to the English what the French were doing to the Vietnamese 400 years later. Anytime you mess with the peasants, they get ornery. It's like kicking a hornet's nest. So R.H. Tawney wrote really the first great book, and he was the first one. Wrote this in 1912, I think I said that. He was the first one to extrapolate from the case of England in the 1500s. Extrapolated around the world. As in the last chapter, he said, you know what? I think you could see the same pattern of behavior around the world with peasantries from different backgrounds. That inspired a whole new school of study, school of history, and that has pretty much proven him right. And R.H. Tawney in this book, and I had to read this book, or portions of it in graduate school, R.H. Tawney in this book has a very vivid, memorable description of what it's like to be a peasant that I've never forgotten. And I looked it up for this lecture, and I put it here. Here's what he said. The situation of the peasant is that of a man standing permanently up to the neck in water, so that even a ripple is sufficient to drown him. That gives you a sense of how perilous the life of a peasant is. The peasant is always living on the edge of catastrophe, the edge of disaster. And their whole world is structured to avoid that disaster, to avoid that catastrophe. There are three imperatives that a peasant must meet to survive. The first is obvious. He needs to feed himself and his family. That's number one. It sounds like a simple thing, but it's not to a peasant. Because every peasant society has a vivid memory, a living memory, of when this condition was not met and when people died in large numbers. It's called famine. Every peasant society suffers them from time to time. Family stories get passed around about parents having to decide during a famine which of their children are going to live. It's the most horrific thing you could ever imagine, and every peasant society suffers it. The peasant world is structured to avoid this catastrophe by growing enough food, enough of a staple crop to feed itself. And when we're talking about Vietnam, of course, we're talking about the staple crop of rice. I had a whole digression about rice growing built into this lecture that I deleted. Because A, you'd fall asleep, Rose Gantner, and B, we wouldn't have time for everything else. But rice is so interesting. Rice is a really interesting crop, and there's a lot of studies written about the cognitive behavior of rice growers versus the cognitive behavior of wheat growers. Rice is an unusual crop. It takes about 10 or 20 times the amount of labor than wheat to grow. It's extremely difficult to grow and very labor intensive. But it's the highest yielding staple crop there is. You could theoretically feed a family in Vietnam on a 1/4 acre of rice. Now, you're not living well, but you're getting your 2,000 calories a day, which is what you need to sustain a decent life. You could eke out enough food to feed your family on a 1/4 acre, and that's important in Vietnam where, as you remember, only 20% of the land is arable. Only 20% of the land is flat. You can't grow rice on 80% of Vietnam, so you have to be very careful about what you grow in Vietnam to survive. This is a map up top where you can see in green are the areas of the world where rice is intensively cultivated. And you can see it's intensively cultivated mainly in Southern Asia. A little bit here on the coasts of South America, a little bit here in the Caribbean, and even the coast of North America. Here, this lower map is a map where wheat is intensively cultivated. And you can see that wheat takes up 3 times more acreage around the world. 3 times more acreage than rice. But it feeds fewer people. Rice feeds more people than any other crop on earth. Today, this day, 20% of all the calories consumed by the Earth's population was consumed in rice. That's how much of it is consumed and how important it is as a staple crop around the world. So, growing enough rice to feed your family is an important imperative. A second imperative is that you have to grow a little bit more than what you need to feed yourself, because there are some things that you can't make yourself. You try to make everything you can. You try to make your own tools, your own clothing, your own soap, you name it, even your own medicines. But there are some things, specialty medicines, heavy tools, livestock, maybe little pieces of land. There are some things that you just can't make yourself and you have to purchase on the market. So you need a little bit of a surplus of rice to trade for those things on the market. And it may be things that will save your family, medicine that will cure an illness, a water buffalo that will replace the one that died, a plow that will allow you to continue farming. So you need to grow enough to feed yourself, a little surplus to trade for the things you can't make yourself, and then the third imperative is, of course, you could predict it, the third imperative is to pay your taxes. You need a little bit more so that you can pay your taxes. Sometimes we call them taxes. You could call it a bribe. You could call it a tithe, a fee, a tribute. It goes by many different names. But wherever peasants live, there's always someone who comes knocking at the village gate every once in a while and they demand to be paid, and you better pay them. Right? Sometimes they say they're representing a king. Sometimes they're representing an emperor. Sometimes they're representing somebody else, an army. And you've got to pay them. And it's called a tithe or a tribute or a tax. And in that case, the village withdraws, they decide how they're going to pay it, and they pay the tax man. So you always need a little bit more. And again, every peasant society, every village has a memory of when the tax man was not happy and dragged off your young men to serve in the military, or dragged off your young men to serve what was called in French Indochina corvée labor, which is kind of like slave labor on behalf of the state, or who put people in debtor's prison, or who confiscated land because they couldn't pay their taxes. So these are the three absolute necessities for a peasant life, and if these necessities are not met, people will die. And the urgency of these necessities is so great that it breeds in the peasant mind a profound aversion of risk. They are risk averse to the extreme. A peasant will give up an excellent chance at a higher income to guarantee a bare subsistence. Does that make sense? Peasants make choices that to us aren't rational. To modern economists, the choices peasants make aren't rational. Peasants don't fit into modern models of economic behavior. Peasants are generally excluded from Econ 101 because they don't follow the rules of a rational agent in the modern market. They follow their own rules that require a whole separate branch of economics represented by these books. These are the kind of books that explain the peasant mind, which is so irrational. And I'll give you a hypothetical. If I offered you guys all each $10, free of charge, no questions asked, or I gave each of you a 50% chance at $1,000, you would take, I hope, the 50% chance of $1,000. You wouldn't, Alex, cheapskate Alex wouldn't. Either would my wife, the Presbyterian. And I think most of us would make that choice because the marginal utility, what economists call the marginal utility of $10 is not that much to us. It won't get us that much. $1,000, the marginal utility of $1,000 is a lot more. We could have a lot of fun with $1,000. $10 you can't have that much fun with. A peasant would take the $10 every single time, because that $10 might save a child's life, where that thought wouldn't even come into our heads. So it's a whole different, you begin to understand that a peasant does not, as a farmer, a peasant is never trying to increase efficiency. A peasant is never trying to maximize yield. A peasant is never trying to improve their quality of life. A peasant is always trying to avoid catastrophe. That's it. That's all. That's all they do. And because of that, they engage in farming practices that seem absurd to us. For example, they do not grow crops like this. These are crops grown in the United States. These are crops grown to maximize yield and maximize efficiency. One seed in straight lines, uniform soil, uniform fertilizer, all get planted at once, all get harvested at once. It's the absolutely most efficient way you could farm. You can minimize your costs and you can maximize your profit. That's the idea for a modern American farmer. A Vietnamese peasant would never grow crops like that. Peasants, no matter where they are, grow their crops like this. Helter-skelter in scattered small plots. As inefficient as you could possibly imagine. The ideal peasant, for a peasant, the ideal is they would not want 6 acres altogether. They would want 6 acres scattered into 12 different plots, far away from each other, on different kinds of ground, different elevation, different kinds of soil, different access to irrigation, using different seed and different fertilizer. That seems insane to us to have to travel around, and remember all these different kind of modes of farming. And it's also a guaranteed for failure. If you have 12 different plots at different elevations and treated all differently, you're almost guaranteed to lose some of them, maybe even half of them. But a peasant doesn't care. A peasant is not trying to maximize yield. A peasant is trying to guarantee subsistence, avoid catastrophe. So they plant differently far afield. It seems crazy. Just consolidate the fields, and maximize your efficiency. But that's not how peasant farmers do it. And it doesn't matter whether it's rice or wheat. These divisions among the rice fields are because there are different peasants farming the different paddies right next to each other. They divide them up and they split them up. A lot of this is, of course, contour farming, but a lot of it is simply how peasants choose to divide their plots. The greatest protection a peasant has, the greatest thing that a peasant has that they will defend to the death in Vietnam is the village. The village is everything. The village does this. The village guarantees, promises you, if you're born into a village, the village promises you, makes you a sacred promise that they will do everything they can to keep you alive. And in return, you owe the village everything. Your life is not your own. Your life belongs to the village. You owe them everything. You owe them every ounce of your labor, every ounce of your loyalty. The only thing standing between you and disaster to a peasant is the village. So peasant villages are so important, and you can see it in the geography today in Europe. Here's an old medieval German village. It's bizarre. These people they have all this land around, and they pile up on one another in these tiny little villages, where they all live close together. And part of the reason to live close together is you want to keep an eye on everybody else. Peasant villages are highly regulated and tightly connected. No such thing as privacy. No such thing as individualism. Everybody has to belong to one another. And then the fields that are planted are surrounding the village 360 degrees. And they're divided up almost scientifically to make sure that the village survives. You can see that pattern here in China. You can see it very well in Afghanistan. You can see it here in a Swedish open field village. The village in this diagram is this black spot here, and then the fields are all divided around it. That is very un-American. Farms on the Great Plains look like this. Europeans for generations have come to the United States and wondered, how do people live like this? How do people live with one house and then another farm 10 miles down the road? But that's because we've never had a peasantry. We're the one country on earth that truly has never had a peasantry. So the whole orientation of our farmers from the very beginning has been commercial. And commercial farming is an entirely different animal than peasant farming. The village gives you everything, and you owe everything to the village. There are a lot of people around the world whose last names are the names of the village. I'm one of them. The original last name, let's see, my grandparents couldn't spell, and they misspelled our last name, but my original last name is Dipastena. That means from Pastena. Pastena is a town in southern Italy that and everybody who came from that village has that name. So it is literally like the village is your family. You belong to the village claims you. And the best protection the village gives you, the best guarantee for survival that the village can give you, is access to what's called the commons. We have very little vestiges of the commons here in our country, again, because we have never had a peasantry. The most famous vestige we have is Boston Common. This was common pasturage until the 1920s. You could bring your cow to Boston Commons to graze, And that was a vestige of this old medieval system, this feudal system, this system of a peasant hierarchy where you share commonly owned land. In every peasant society, a peasant village has common owned land that make up between, say, 20% and 60% of the village land. That means, say, half of a village land is not owned by anybody, it's owned by the village. And you can see here's a diagram of a common medieval manor where you have the village right here, and then the fields here, and the green are all common lands, and then the orange are lands that belong to the landlords. Landlords. This is kind of difficult to talk about because we think about landlords as mostly somebody who owns land. And let's say that they do. Let's put it that way. A landlord is somebody who owns the land. And there are many peasant economies where a landlord will own all the land in the village except for the commons. And you rent from the landlord. Your family might have lived on that plot of ground, might have farmed that land for 9 generations, but you've never owned it. There's always been a landlord to whom you had to pay rent. And that is the case with Vietnam. There were a lot of landlords. They were the people who owned a lot of the land in a village. But even that's not quite true, and this is where it gets a little abstract and confusing. In a peasant economy, in a feudal world, in the medieval world, there was no concept of private property. That's hard to wrap your head around. Landlords were seen more as caretakers of the land. You might have remembered, in elementary school or junior high school or high school even, learning of the feudal pyramid of power that looked like this, where you have, most of the peasants doing all the hard work at the bottom of the pyramid, and they would pay rent and give their military service, give their labor to those who are above them, vassals, who were the landlords. And the landlords, however, they didn't even own the land, right? Because they paid rent to higher nobles. And these higher nobles, these dukes and counts, they didn't even really technically own the land, not in the sense that we understand, because they all had to pay tribute or pay rent or pay tax to the king. So the King of England technically owned all of England. But since England is so big, he can't farm it all. He needs to rent it out to vassals, who then rent it out to peasants. And that is how they take care of England. That's the idea. But even the king doesn't own England. Who owns England? God. That's exactly it. God owns England. God owns the world. God has chosen the king to be the steward of his creation. And the king, as a trustworthy steward, then chooses trustworthy vassals to take care, to be caretakers of God's great bounty. And the mission on earth is to kind of keep everybody alive and multiply. That's the idea. This is every peasant society is bound up in very strict religious concepts of how the world should be ordered. The problem is that landlords sometimes renege on their obligations. Landlords, they're supposed to be good guys. They're called pater, father. They're supposed to be the father of the village, take care of their children, the peasants. And that means, yeah, you work for the landlord. You serve in his army. You give him your labor. If the landlord needs a wall to be built, you're there building the wall and no pay because you owe it to him. And in return, the landlord saves you when your family's about to starve. In return, the landlord regularly treats you with gifts, especially for a wedding. Village peasant weddings are a sight to behold. You know, the landlord is supposed to lay out a big banquet, a lot of alcohol, you know, tons of food. Peasants budget for weddings in their village because they know they're going to get fed and they know they're going to get a supply. They budget their revenue, the annual revenue of a peasant household figures in a village wedding where they're going to be able to, you know, take home some food and maybe have some gifts courtesy of the landlord. As you could imagine, landlords hated this. Hated being the ones to throw a drunken party for an entire village several times a year. And so sometimes they would skimp out on the banquet. Maybe they'd water down the rice wine, you know? Or they would not live up to the obligations, the traditional paternalistic obligations of a landlord. And when that happened, peasants got ornery. And they knew how to take care of bad landlords. And there was a very strict procedure for how peasants took care of landlords, bad landlords. It was a tried and true procedure that is copied in every peasant society. And the first step is you simply formally present a grievance to the landlord. Now, as a peasant, you can't read or write. That's why you have to have a priest living in your village. The village priest, whether he be Buddhist or Orthodox or Catholic or whatever, the village priest is a very important person. He is literate, he writes for you, and he's there to maintain the ethical, the moral, and the spiritual equilibrium of the village. He's there to adjudicate conflicts with the landlord. So you would go to the village priest and you would say, you know, a family almost starved to death, the landlord did nothing, we need to write a grievance to the landlord. And the priest will write it out, will deliver the grievance, and most of the time that's all you really need to get the landlord back in line. But if that doesn't work, you have to go over the landlord's head. You have to work channels to escalate your petition of grievances to the king. And history, medieval European history, I should say, is filled. The archives, the European archives are filled with petitions like this. Sometimes they're printed, sometimes they're written out. They're delivered to the king, to the monarch of a country throughout Europe, of peasant grievances. This is what our landlord failed to do. You have to come save us from the landlord, correct the landlord, punish the landlord, get him back in line. We know a lot about what medieval conflicts were like, or feudalistic conflicts were like in Europe, because we have these wonderful records of how bad the landlords were behaving, say in Romania in the early 20th century, which is where this petition of the peasants to the king of Romania comes from. If the king ignores that petition, then you go to the third step, which is terrorism. You do vigilante violence. That's the idea. You take things that don't belong to you, and you redistribute that wealth to the people who need it. Have you ever heard of Robin Hood? That's where the legend of Robin Hood comes from, because these thieves, these vigilantes, never used their names. They always covered their faces. And in England in the 1500s or in the 1300s, the word that the English would use, the English peasants would use, would be Robin Hood. You know, Robin Hood is afield, looking to exact justice from the landlord. So there was Robin Hood, a story that was first written down in 1377. Every peasant would recognize that story. A more recent example of kind of vigilante behavior on the behalf of peasants was this group in China, Society of the Righteous and Harmonious Fists, in 1900. They were called the Boxers, the Boxer Rebellion. If this vigilante behavior doesn't work, and this includes, like, you could hang the landlord in effigy, you could burn down an outbuilding, You can slaughter one of his animals and leave it on his doorstep. Have you ever seen The Godfather? The horse's head in the bed, that kind of stuff. That's what you do. Peasants don't screw around when they want to scare you, man. And if this fails, that's when you reach the fourth stage, which is a peasant revolt. Peasant revolts are common. They happen periodically. They happen in every peasant society. And they tend to be very violent and bloody, very short in duration, and highly successful in restoring the equilibrium of the village. So there's a lot of death, there's a lot of destruction. This is when you kill the landlord, and you chop him up into pieces and you make a big deal out of it, right? And then your side suffers a lot of recriminations, but in the end, when everything blows over, life gets back to the way it was, which is all you're asking for as a peasant. You want things to go back to the way they were. You're not working towards a new glorious future. You want to go back to the golden age when everybody had enough rice to eat. Peasant revolt is what happened in Vietnam in 1930. The peasant revolts in Vietnam were some of the most violent of any peasant society in history. They were sudden, they were massive, and they occurred up and down the length of Vietnam. And it was because, of course, for 30 years, the French had been transforming this stable, conservative, agrarian peasant world into something else, into a modern industrial market economy. And every time this transition has occurred in history, and it's occurred all over the world, from England and France and Russia and Italy and parts of Africa and Asia, the transition from what we would call the feudal system to a modern capitalist system. Everywhere that transition has occurred, there's been revolution. The English Revolution, the French Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, the Russian Revolution. It just happens. It's one of the products of this transition. But in England, this transition took 300 years. In Vietnam, it took 30 years. And it was a foreign occupying power imposing it on the country of Vietnam. So when the revolt came, it was enormous. And part of the reason, I think, of the violence of the peasant revolt in Vietnam in 1930 was because of the idealism of the French. The French really believed that they were not just kind of coming in and scraping off the surface wealth of Vietnam. The French really believed, as this poster shows, and this woman represents La France, the French really believed that they were bringing, as her shield shows, progress, civilization, and commerce to a benighted world. They were bringing, and they were bringing a progressive commercial civilization to a land that had been a traditional feudalistic peasant land. And that disruption is what triggered just an amazing upsurge of violence in Vietnam. And the way the French established the baseline for the French Revolution in Vietnam was the introduction of the concept of private property. As I said, a feudalistic world doesn't have a strong concept of private property. Property is mostly communal, and property is, even when you control the property, you don't outright own it, right? So the first step in this transition from the feudal world to a market-based capitalistic world is you need to establish the principle of private property. And this has to get established through the law, through the courts, and enforced by the police. So here you have on the left a traditional English feudalistic village. Here you can see all the strips of land, and for the purposes of illustration here, the historian has blacked out the fields that belong to one farm family only. You can see how spread out they are. This is just so irrational and so inefficient, but it's how peasants farm and how they choose to farm. This is what happened after what the English called the enclosure movement. That is, when the courts came in, when the police came in, and this took centuries, and redefined village land tenure as ownership of private property. So now the landlord wasn't just the tenant-in-chief deserving of a rent. The landlord was the owner of the property who could evict peasant families from their land because he owned it. And when he did evict, he enclosed the land and rented it out in larger, more rational plots to commercial farmers. So compare this crazy quilt patchwork to this, much more efficient, much more rational. And I will hesitate, I don't hesitate to say that this kind of mode of farming guarantees poverty. This is not going to build you a better world. This is not going to bring you prosperity because it's so inefficient. It brings stability, which is what peasants value. This will bring higher yields, greater wealth, a more prosperous economy, but it's going to cause you have to overthrow this old system before you get here. The other thing, of course, that the principle of private property introduces in Vietnam and everywhere where feudalism is replaced by capitalism is you have to get rid of the commons. The commons don't make any sense. Who owns the commons? One of the first things that the French did when they came in after 1900 was they began systematically going village to village and auctioning off the common land. Those who won at the auction tended to be the landlords. So common land became private land. And common land was not just farming, and I should say a little bit more about how the commons worked. Let's say you're a peasant family, and the head of the household is named Todd, and he's a bad farmer and a lazy SOB, and he doesn't know anything. And so because of that, he has 8 kids, and they're all starving. The rest of the village is doing well, but poor old Todd, he can't seem to, plow straight, and he's in bad shape. But he's a member of the village. So the village elders get together, led by the priest, and they have a meeting. What are we going to do about this dumbbell Todd? We'd like to throw him in the river, but his poor kids, we can't blame them for him. So we have to save them somehow. So the village elders vote. They will come back to me and they'll say, you are allowed to pull 10 fish from the common stream and sell it at the market. You're permitted to chop down 10 trees in the common forest and sell the timber. And we will give you the proceeds of a ½ acre of the common land to live on. That's how the commons works. It's your social insurance. It's your insurance as a village member. So when the commons is gone, you've lost your insurance. You've lost your safety net that could save you from disaster. Yes?
We bought a house in a village of 1,000 people in Suffolk, England in the 70s, and all of those villages that I can remember had common land called the village green.
Yep.
And they would have a very small, modest building, which was the village, the town hall,
Yes.
the little social hall.
Yeah. And that's what we would call the vestige or the remnant of this feudalistic principle or this feudalistic program of the commons. The English especially are big into heritage, and so they like to preserve something of the feudalistic world that has been swept aside. So often they'll preserve a village green and call it the commons. So that's the vestige of this old feudal medieval world that went by the wayside. The mechanism that the French used to kind of move farmers into a modern commercial relationship was taxes. Taxes are powerful. They are very powerful tools that states use to direct your behavior. to shape your behavior, right? To give you incentives towards behavior. And the French immediately changed the tax structure. This is the old flag of the Nguyen dynasty before the French arrived. This is the flag of French Indochina after the French arrived. So I'm going to compare how the tax systems worked under the old emperor versus under the new French, and you'll see why it was so onerous and difficult to live under the French, and much easier as a peasant to live under the old Nguyen emperor. The rates under the Nguyen emperor were low. The French imposed higher rates. Under the old emperor, there are more. I should say this: that in Vietnam, the village system is still so strong today, as a vestige of feudalism. There are more villages in Vietnam than there are municipalities in the United States. And this is a country of fewer than 1/3 the number of people as here. Villages retain a lot of power. The French, when they arrived, immediately made an effort to catalog every village and to make sure every village got visited by the tax collector every year. The emperor never had the army of bureaucrats able to do that. The emperor, you knew, was going to come around every 3 years, every 5 years, but not every year. The French came every year, and they demanded to be paid every year. The emperor, the old emperor, had tax rates built on a sliding scale depending on how well your crop did. So if you lost 20% of your crop, you'd get your tax bill chopped. The French did not. The French had a uniform tax rate that was collected every year because they had budgets to meet. This is important. The emperor collected a whole village tax. They would tax the village, not the individual residents of the village or the households within the village, but the whole village itself. This was a deference to the power of the village. There's a saying in every peasant society: the laws of the emperor bow to the customs of the village. So the emperor was smart enough to know, you go right up to the edge of the village and you say, hey, the village owes me $1,000. You guys decide how you're going to pay us. And that's, once again, the elders would get together with the priest and they would decide where that revenue was going to come from, who was going to contribute to it, and then the whole village would pay the tax. The French did not tax that way. They imposed a head tax. The head of every household owed the tax, took the role of the village entirely out of the equation. And then finally, under the emperor, taxes were paid in kind. That is, you were permitted to pay your tax in any commodity that had value. You could pay it in salt, you could pay it in rice wine, you could pay it in rice itself. The French, however, demanded cash money, hard currency. Peasants rarely handled money. You'll remember this is an issue with the Whiskey Rebellion in 1794. In this neck of the woods, Pittsburghers couldn't get their hands on hard currency, and then here comes Alexander Hamilton imposing this new whiskey excise tax that had to be paid in Bank of the United States banknotes, and there was no Bank of the United States here in Pittsburgh. That was a disaster, and that led to the Whiskey Rebellion. Well, a similar thing happens in France. Peasants now need to scramble for piastres, which they had never seen before, to pay their taxes. Where are you going to get a piastre? Well, the logical thing to do is you grow a little bit more rice and you sell it on the market for money. And peasants had been used to selling rice on the market or trading their rice on the market. But under the emperor, when you go to market 5 miles down the road and sell your surplus rice, you're competing against rice that's grown right around you. No rice is exported, or very little rice is ever exported. And the market for rice is stable. Rice isn't imported, rice isn't exported, and the price of rice stays about the same over time. So you know how much surplus you need to sell in order to raise the funds to pay your taxes. Under the French, it's a different story. The French open up the floodgates. They allow rice to be exported, and Vietnam becomes the second biggest exporter of rice in the world by 1930. The French are exporting more, French Indochina is exporting more rice than any place in the world except Burma by 1930. By 1930, and I should say this, French Indochina is growing far more rice than it has ever grown in its history, but it's consuming less than it ever has because it's being exported. So while the rice bounty is great, it means the rice is being exported, which means the price of rice falls on local markets, because now your rice is competing with rice grown in India and Indonesia and Burma. It's hard to sell enough rice to pay your taxes, which means you have to go to option number 2, and that is you sell yourself to a coal mine. You sell your 16-year-old son to a rubber plantation. And those are death sentences. Between 1912 and 1940, 17,000 laborers died on the Michelin rubber plantation alone. This was a hard, horrifying life. But it was the only way you could earn money to send back to the village to pay the taxes. So this meant that by 1930, 70% of Vietnam's peasants had lost their land. They were homeless, they were on the road, they were headed to mines and plantations. You had a huge hunger rate. 50%, the estimate was, in Vietnam, of the Vietnamese people being malnourished. You can see here are beggars on the side of the road. This is called a family of lice eaters. And it was in 1930 when this culminated, this roiling disaster just exploded in a series of horrific revolts everywhere in Vietnam. All of these, and these revolts of 1930-31 are memorialized to no end by the Vietnamese Communist Party today. You see memorials to them, statues to them, to the great martyrs of the revolts of 1930. Here's a map of Vietnam. Everywhere where there's one of these explosion icons is where there was a major revolt. So you can see it happened everywhere, and it happened all at once. They began in the summer and into the fall of 1930. And the amazing thing about these revolts is they were almost entirely unconnected from each other. They didn't even communicate with one another. They just all happened at once. And they didn't see themselves as part of a big unified movement to overthrow the French. They saw themselves as a revolt to get back to the traditional feudalistic relationship that they had with their landlords. The most violent revolts and the most memorable ones happened in the 2 neighboring provinces of Nguyen An and Ha Tinh, which, by the way, I'm horrifically mispronouncing. Ha Tinh. That's how you say Ha Tinh. Ha Tinh. And I'm not going to say that because I sound like an idiot. So I'll call it Nguyen An and Ha Tinh. This is where Ho Chi Minh was from. These are very poor districts, very poor provinces, population starving, petitions to the landlord don't work. A group of villagers get together, they march on the provincial capital of Vinh. They have a petition that they want to present to the French governors, and a single French bomber plane flies over them, drops 2 bombs, kills 200 people. Because they thought they were marching on. The French thought that the Vietnamese were marching on the French to fight. The people scatter, they come back to gather the dead to bury them. Another bomb is dropped, killing 15 more people. That triggered an explosive revolt where the peasants of Nguyen An and Ha Tinh, they break into an arsenal, they grab the weapons, they kill every French person they could see. They kill every landlord and members of their family that they could see. They then retreat back to their villages and they start farming. To them, they won. They restore the commons, they split up the land, and they have a happy old time farming the way that they have forever. It took the French 9 months to gather colonial troops from Africa, French troops from France, sail them around the world to Vietnam, and retake control of these villages. And when they did, they executed everyone. 10,000 executions, I think, in the span of 60 days of the leaders of these revolts. They had a traveling guillotine to do it. This was, in other words, the French had an easy job. All they had to do was land troops and retake these villages, because these villagers were not unified. They were missing the whole point. Here they had a chance, really, to overthrow the French, but they were still thinking like peasants. They were still thinking of loyalty to their villages. What these peasants lacked was any concept of nationalism. They had no concept of Vietnam as a nation. Nationalism. It's a tricky idea. What makes us loyal to a country today, to a country where millions of our residents, of our fellow countrymen, live thousands of miles away from us and will never see? The United States of America. But we are. You know, what breeds loyalty to a country that you can never, to a place, an expanse of land that you could never really know intimately? That's the question of nationalism. What is nationalism? How's it come? This is another digression that I'll avoid, except to say there's a difference between creating a state or creating a country and imbuing nationalism in its residents. You know, these two people, Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, they got married. Castile was a kingdom, Aragon was a kingdom. These two got married. Watch this animation, it'll knock your socks off. They get married, and they create this new thing called Spain. They created it in 1469, but Spanish nationalism didn't come until the 1800s. You know, just because you create a state with a name and call it Iraq or Afghanistan doesn't mean that the peasants living in those places are going to have allegiance to the country of Iraq or the country of Afghanistan, because they don't have a concept of nationalism. Nationalism has to be taught. You know, you have to be inducted into nationalism. You need a flag, you need a national anthem, you need a national story. You need some building up of sympathy with people who live far away from you that you'll never meet. And that's a long and difficult project. Think how long it took, for example, for Italy to become a country. Even when Italy unified in 1871, they still didn't have nationalism. They really don't still have it today. Germany. How you take a country like Germany in 1789 of hundreds of different kingdoms and create one nationalistic state out of it all. Or, what about this country? When did we become a nation? Did we become a nation when the US Constitution was ratified? No way. No way. And then we have so many tests in history. My favorite test for when we become a nation is you get a great graduate from West Point, the National Military Academy. In 1861, he has to choose between his loyalty to his country, the United States of America, or his loyalty to his state, the state of Virginia. And he chooses his state. That's Robert E. Lee. You can't say that we're a nation. You can't say that we have nationalism if somebody is eminent and is connected to the national government, as Robert E. Lee was, chooses his state over the nation. It took the Civil War at least, I think, for nationalism to even begin to take hold in the United States. Nationalism requires a lot of infrastructure. Nationalism requires that you have roads that connect these isolated villages to each other. Bridges. Rivers need to be dredged. Ports need to be created. Systems of communication and transportation need to be created. You need radio, you need telegraph, you need railroads. You need all these things that the French brought to Vietnam. The French provided the material conditions that the Vietnamese required to create nationalism. And the first Vietnamese nationalist to recognize that the French were actually encouraging Vietnamese nationalism was this guy, and he's considered a hero in Vietnam today. His name is Phan Boi Chau, and you could take one look at him and know he ain't no peasant, right? He's exactly what you would imagine a nationalist to be. That is, he's urban, involved in long-distance trade. He's traveled up and down Vietnam. He's seen that every damn village is exactly like every other village, you know? And all these people are exactly alike. And then we could call them all Vietnamese. And these all people have interests in common. And he's literate. He uses the networks of transportation and communication, and he is revered today as the founding nationalist of Vietnam. He's the one who started the first nationalist party, and his program of national liberation was that, you know, we need to become a nation, a bona fide nation to overthrow the French. Look what he looks like, Phan Boi Chau. When we go to Vietnam, and we've done, Veterans Breakfast Club has done 3 trips to Vietnam. I've gone with Vietnam veterans. I always make a stop at the tomb of Phan Boi Chau, because the tomb is so telling about Vietnamese culture. Here's Phan Boi Chau, here's his tomb. Looks nothing like him. The Vietnamese so worship kind of fierce warriors that they make him into a warrior. But he wasn't a warrior. He was an intellectual. And he recognized this, that the French had brought the bridges and the roads and the railroads that can make Vietnam a nation. And they also brought the ideas of revolution. The French had a revolution, and they taught it in Vietnamese schools. And what he said is, we need to embrace what the French are teaching us so that we can overthrow the French. And he said this in French. He said, and I'll translate, oppression has come from the French, but the spirit of liberation also. We have to be inspired by the French Revolution and the spirit of liberation. And his program for national liberation was this: the Vietnamese must embrace modernization. We have to become like Japan and industrialize. Number 2, independence. This movement has to be led by people like him, the urban middle class. And number 3, the peasants are just going to have to follow us, because the peasants are incapable still of thinking like a nation. They're still thinking of themselves as members of a village first. Of course, Phan Boi Chau failed in his effort to overthrow the French. He went down in history as a failure. He was constantly under surveillance because he never left cities. The French arrested him many, many times. He spent the last 15 years of his life under house arrest, where he wrote his memoirs. And in his memoirs, he wrote this: "My history is entirely a history of failure. But there is no doubt that our nation will achieve independence eventually. Today, there are people more capable than I am. Have you ever heard of Nguyen Ai Quoc?" Nguyen Ai Quoc was a man who had left the country in 1910. He was studying Phan Boi Chau. He was observing events, the revolts, what was happening to the peasantry. Nguyen Ai Quoc would choose 1940 to return to Vietnam and lead this new movement for national liberation, in which he believed the peasants could participate. He crossed the Chinese border, and he changed his name, Nguyen Ai Quoc, to Ho Chi Minh. And that's where we'll pick up the story. Thank you.